Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Yoel HaKohen Khan Olav Hashalom, and is in the schus and merit of Rav Zev Yecheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz Le'erich Yomim V'Shanim Tevis for many long, healthy years. So we're in the middle of chapter 4, Perek Daled of Tanya. Last week, I did an entire overview of the concept that the levushay, the garments that we use, thought, speech, and action, that manifest Torah mitzvahs, is godle v'gova ma'oid ad ma losam le'en kates v'sof, even on the quality of nefesh ruach u'neshama atzmon, that they're infinitely greater than the quality of the soul itself, specifically nefesh ruach neshama. So we've gone over that in detail. Just briefly, and the point that we're going to be learning now is going to be understanding really the power, the awesome power of Torah mitzvahs. And what is the Nekuda? Just using the example from the Alter Rebbe in Tanya. In chapter 2, he explained, every neshama is like a child. Bonim atem la'Hashem alekechem, b'ni b'chei Yisrael. Like a child of God. A child of a father, in a physical example, is not just a student, not just a reflection, but his very substance, his very genetic matter, stuff, is made from the etzem moyach ha'av. And as such, he is essentially the father, but he's a separate entity, he's a child. And that's why he's a chelik elekam and mal mamish, a very part of the divine itself, like the child's a part of the father. Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, within him is imbued the techiyuse and primiyuse, the inner dimension of the divine, so to speak, kavyachol. All this, of course, is speaking in the language of man, that we should be able to understand it somewhat. But that fundamental, on a physical, biological connection of child to father, is similar to a neshama's connection to the Eibishter. An atzmizdike connection is called. A student is not born from the teacher, not physically. He has a mind, the teacher has a mind, the teacher teaches him. He can change his life. And in some ways, students are compared to children. But he's not from the very biological matter. And here, the neshama is coming from chachmosei, machshavte yizbarach, Yisrael olu b'machshava. So they are actually part of God's thought and God's mind, and the innermost part, because they're the purpose of creation. Torah mitzvahs is the actual father, is the limbs of the father. Evore de Malke, he called it. The limbs of the king. That's what he called it here in this chapter. So that's different. The limbs of the father are not the limbs of the child. The child comes from that same material, but it's a separate entity. So when you say the idea of a neshama, the neshama is a separate entity that carries the very essence of Elokus. Torah mitzvahs is an extension of the Father himself. So in a way you could say when a neshama now embraces Torah mitzvahs through using its thought, speech, and action to implement and to actualize through its acts, through its actions, through its speech, through its thoughts, Torah mitzvahs, it's like the child embracing his father. So you have the best of both worlds. A neshama, the child, which is from the same essence of the father, but it's a separate entity, is now embracing his father. How do you embrace his father? God is beyond embrace, as we're going to learn now in detail, through Torah mitzvahs, which is the gift that God gives us and says, embrace my Torah mitzvahs, then you embrace me. That's what he said. Hamakaimon be'emes. How do you truly fulfill mitzvahs? When you do it out of love, you love God. How do you connect to God? You connect to God through his Torah mitzvahs. So Torah mitzvahs, therefore, now takes on a whole different meaning. They're not just God's commands. It's not just God's so-called book of laws and commands and directives. You could have a king, he gives us directives, do this, do that. There's still the king's directives, and they have to be listened to. But Torah is much more than that. Torah mitzvahs is actually a piece of God, so to speak. Again, Kavyochel, we have to say. It's not just the king is ordering and commanding us, do this, put on tefillin, keep Shabbos, eat kosher. But actually every mitzvah is a piece of him, is a part of his own very limbs. Evorid de Malka, Shem Ramach, Evorid de Malka, as he put it. And the mitzvah leisase, as he said, are these yesod of all the of the yira is the mitzvah, the root of all the mitzvahs leisase. But here we're talking about evorid de Malka. It's easier to understand. Organs of the king. So his commands, his mitzvahs, and his Torah are actually an extension of him. Now, of course, the Eibishter himself is higher than his own so-called structure, than his own limbs and organs. Just like a human being is not just the sum total of his limbs and organs, but the limbs and organs are not outside forces. They are very much part and parcel of who you are. So when you embrace Torah mitzvahs, you're embracing actually the body, so to speak, that the Eibishter manifested, not a physical body, the body of Torah mitzvahs, which is not just his commands, but is very evarim de malka. So the child, who comes from the same essence of the father, is now embracing his father. He's embracing his entire being through Torah and mitzvahs, and that creates a unity, the ultimate unity. And in that sense, Torah and mitzvahs has a maila. The levushim that manifest Torah and mitzvahs is gava v'godla mailosim lein keids v'seif al mailas nefesh ruach and neshama atzmon, as we discussed at length. And the Alter Rebbe continues, and we'll read it inside, even though we learned it, it's worthwhile reading again. Kamei shekasa b'zayar. Where do we know, where do we see, besides the fact that mitzvahs is evarim de malka, which comes from Tikkun Zayar? We now say, the Zayar says explicitly, the Zayar teaches, that the Torah and God are totally one. Now, if it was just commands of a king, you don't say a king is one with his decrees. A king can make many decrees. A decree to tax his people, a decree that people should be drafted in the army, a decree that everybody should be kind, a decree that you should have people should celebrate. I mean, all kinds of decrees. Gzeres HaMelech. Every king writes laws and decrees. Doesn't say anyway those decrees are one with him. No, but by Teire, Raisa v'kutshe b'richu kul echad. Pirush, the Raisa, which is hi chachmose v'ritzein shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that which is the wisdom and the desire of God, the wisdom and will of God. Hu v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu, his ritzeinu is chachmose v'ritzeinu. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the one that this is the chachma and rotzen of his, hu b'kvei de ba'atzmei kul echad. That's the word. So Araisa, which is the rotzen and chachma v'rotzen of the Eibishter, the wisdom and the desire, are not just his wisdom and his desire so-called separate from him. It's one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'kvei de ba'atzmei, with himself in all his glory. But here comes the question, one second, the Eibishter we know is higher than any structure. So the Alter Rebbe quotes the Rambam, because it says, he continues now, Ki, Hu hayedeya v'hu amado. He is simultaneously the knower and the power to know. Since Torah is knowledge, therefore the Eibishter is one with his knowledge, as we learned in chapter 2 about the Neshamas in the name of the Rambam. So there you have that he, though he's higher than it all, but he's one and united with his very wisdom and his very knowledge, and in this case, Torah and mitzvahs. This helps explain the unity. So the Zohar states it, the Rambam in a sense helps explain it, and as we learned in chapter 2, this is how the Eibishter manifests in Atzilus, according to how the Arizal explains it, in the Haggadah in chapter 2. So you'll say, one second, you're quoting now the same Rambam that you quoted in chapter 2 about Neshamas. So clearly, it has two different goals and objectives. In chapter 2, the Alter Rebbe also brought that God is beyond, we don't understand God's mind. But there, and Hu Amadav Yedei is united with the Yudeya, which means he's united with Chachmase v'machshavte, which is the root of the soul. But there the goal was just to explain how a soul, I don't want to say just, to explain how a soul, the child, is one with God. Why? Because he's one with God's mind, because that's where the very life, the very essence of the child is rooted. Be'etzem moyach ha'av. The moyach ha'av, in the case of the nimshal and the moral here, is God. He is one with chachmase v'machshavte, and therefore the neshama retains its fundamental connection, but it's still a child. Here he's bringing the same idea, but now about the very limbs of God. That God is one with the Torah and mitzvahs, with his rotzen and his chachmah. There he was one with his chachmah, which would become the root that would then separate in a separate child, still retaining complete chelik elikam and malmamish, even the neshamas that come down all the way below, through their connection to Torah, as I pointed out, that they also need Torah to help so-called activate or reveal that connection. And here he's coming to explain how Torah itself is hu v'raisa v'kudshe brichu kul echad. So that ends this piece, but now comes a tremendous section. I mean, every piece in Tanya is, but the Alter Rebbe is now going to give us in full glory what Torah mitzvahs really is. Because it still needs explanation. At the end of the day, Torah and mitzvahs, fine, you say it's the limbs of the Eibusher, it's hu amado, hu ayedev, hu amado. But still, Torah mitzvahs does manifest in details. First of all, 248 mitzvahs essa, 365 negative mitzvahs. Torah itself is made up of details. Verses, laws, it comes down on klaf, you write, it comes down in words on paper. Bereishis bara lekim. So yes, you just explain to me how it's all one. But since your whole point is to say that through the garments of machshava dibra ma'aseh it has a quality even over the neshamas, because the neshamas separate and the Torah mitzvahs remain like the limbs, an extension of the king himself, but it's still a far lower level than the king himself. Yes, he's united with it, and that's what he's going to address now to explain how Torah mitzvahs manifests the divine infinite, even that which is beyond structure. Because if you say Torah mitzvahs only manifest that which we relate to, so yes, it's much better than anything else. There's nothing else in existence that helps us connect to God. But it's still God in terms, so to speak, in terms of the structure of existence. And now we're going to learn Torah mitzvahs is coming all the way from the highest levels. And even as it manifests in details that we can relate to, it still retains that achdus in a revealed way. Neshamas also retain achdus. I have to repeat that again. But they're yotzu v'nifradu, as the Alter Rebbe says later in Ageres HaKedesh. They're a child that's separated from a father. That's the whole point. If the child was an extension of the father, the whole kavanah of Yeridas HaNeshama B'guf, of a soul coming down into this world and making it a dira b'tachtenim, a home for the divine, would not be possible. In other words, if a neshama was like Torah, it would just continue to be an extension of the king. Melech Malcham Lochem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We need the neshama to have the king's essential energy, the father and son, but a separate son that can travel to other places and bring the king's will and desire, meaning Torah and mitzvahs, and needs Torah and mitzvahs to retain that revealed unity. So now he's going to go into this discussion, opening with a question, the qualification. So now he says, and this you could say, this section is now talking about how Torah travels all the way from the highest levels all the way down to the levels down below where we are. It has to retain the divinity and not like a neshama separate like a child, but it also has to relate to us that it speaks to us and we can understand it, and in turn through that connect. I want to just say one more point, which is good to worthy mentioning. I mentioned the difference between who he brings the Rambam here in chapter 4 and he brings the Rambam in chapter 2. It's interesting. In chapter 2 he starts hu hamada hu yedeya. Here he starts hu yedeya hu hamada. You can guess why. The Frierdiker Rebbe has a whole letter on this. The Rebbe's father, Rabbi Yitzchak, has a big explanation. Because here he's talking hu yedeya, he's talking about the yedeya first. The yedeya being the knower, the Eibishter. Raisa, kutshebrichu kul echad, because you want to focus on the Eibishter, who the Torah is one with. And then you say the huamada, the knower and the power to know. And then there's of course the yudua, that which is known, but he doesn't mention. He just says v'chulu. In that order. In Perek Beis, he's talking about the child that's separated from the father. So he starts with hu hayedeya. He starts with hu amada, and then he goes to hu hayedeya, because he's talking now about that which is the power to know, and that's one with the one that knows, with the father. So that's just a diuk I wanted to just add. So now he goes like this. Now he qualifies. So let's continue on. There's a period now, which is like another section in the chapter 4. He begins another section. He says, "Va'av da'Kadosh Baruch Hu nikra ein sof." And even though Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, blessed be He, is called ein sof, without end, which indicates something that doesn't have limits. And now he's going to bring 4 different expressions, 4 different verses. Well, 3 verses, and 1 expression from Tikkun Zeyar that all proves this case. Because as you see, that Alter Rebbe is grounding everything in sources. So now, or hu ideya v'hu amada is the order here. So now he says, even though the Eibishter is Ein Sof, and here goes, here are the expressions. Ulugdalose ein cheker, and his greatness can never be fathomed. That's in Tehillim 145:3. Expression number 2. V'les machshava tfisa beklal, and no thought can grasp him at all. Tikkun Zeyar Yud Zayin Aleph 17a. And number 3, v'chein, that's the Eibishter himself. So 2 expressions, that l'gdose ein cheker, his greatness can never be fathomed, and no thought can grasp him. Now he says, and also that's also is Ritzene v'chachmose. Remember we said before, Teira is Ritzene and chachmose, God's will and God's wisdom. It also says the same idea. What does he say? Kidiksiv v'chein b'Ritzene v'chachmose. So not just Eibishter himself, but also Ritzene chachmose kidiksiv ein cheker l'sfunose. And similarly, his will and his wisdom are also described in a way that you can't grasp. His understanding no one can fathom. Before he said, his greatness can never be fathomed. Now he says, his understanding no one can fathom. And that pasuk in Yeshaya, Mem Chof Ches 40:28. And then finally, Uksiv, Hacheker Alika Timtso. And it's also written, can you, through searching, find God? Bitmiya. In other words, even, what did we say? I counted 4. There's a 5th expression. I said 4. There's actually 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. So now he says, can you, through searching, find God? In other words, even searching, you can't find God. Even when you're doing a search. That's an EU of Yud Aleph Zayin. And comes the 5th expression, uksiv, kiloi machshavei seichem. Not just that he is beyond, but his thought. For my thoughts are not your thoughts. This is Yeshaya Nun Heiches, 55:8. So here's not the place to explain why the Alter Rebbe brings dafka these 5 rayas, and why 5 and not 6, and why not 4, and what each one adds. But suffice it to say that it's in 2 categories. He's proving that the Eibishter is Ein Sof, both the very essence of the divine, and also his wisdom, and also the Tzene v'chachmase. So 2 proofs for the first part and 3 for the latter, as I just enumerated. So based on that, this is still all a qualification, a question. So based on that, how do we reconcile it with the fact that Torah and mitzvahs that you just told me is one with him, basically the limbs, the extension of this melech who's Ein Sof. Not only he's Ein Sof, but also Chachmas and Ritzene Chachmas is Ein Sof, cannot be fathomed, cannot be reached, all the different expressions. So how do you reconcile that with Torah mitzvahs, which we know has definition, as he continues, afterwards explaining. So therefore, we have a question on the table. How could a human being who's a defined creation, we're saying through Torah and mitzvahs, through his garments of thought, speech, and action, manifesting Torah and mitzvahs, he becomes connected with this Ein Sof. So now the Alter Rebbe answers, Hine al zeh amru. To this Chazal, we're taught. It has been taught, b'mokim shata moitzei gdulosei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu sham ata moitzei an vosanusai. In the same place, the Gemara tells us in Megillah 31a, Lamed Aleph Aleph. In the same place that you find the greatness of God, there you find his humility. Now, the simple interpretation you could say that we find in Torah, when it talks about God's greatness, you also talk about God's humility. But here is going to give the inner dimension of this explanation. That the very manifestation in defined structures is part of God's greatness. In other words, God is not limited by just expressing himself in great ways. His humility is found in his greatness. His humility is also an expression of his infinite greatness. To use a quote from Rab Meir Ibn Gabbai in Avodas HaKodesh, though he doesn't cite it here, but just it's a good way to explain it. He says, talks about Ein Sof, Kishem Sheyeh B'Yicholte, Livrei Bilti Bal Gvul, just like he has the power to create infinite, Bli Gvul. Kach B'Yicholte Livrei Gvul. So too, he has the power to create the finite. Because if not, Ata Machase B'Shleimuseh. That alone tells you he's limited, that he could only do Bli Gvul and not Gvul. Now, this is not to say that God is God forbid, limited. It's coming from weakness, it's coming from strength. His greatness is such that he could be expressed even in his humility, even, so to speak, in small structures, even in definition. So that's the first statement that Alter Rebbe says in explaining, as I said, this vast panorama of what is Torah and mitzvahs. It's ultimately going to be a interface of paradoxes. On one hand, it's going to manifest Ein Sof, and that's why when you grasp Torah and mitzvahs, you grasp the Eibishter. Even though less machshava tvisa beklal, like we said, that no thought can grasp him, and our thoughts are not his thoughts, and all the 5 different expressions he brought, four verses and 1 tikkun zeyar. And on the other hand, the Torah is grasped by us, so it has both elements. So the first statement we have to know is that the Torah, he didn't refer to Torah yet, that God's, like he said, the same place you find his greatness, you find his humility. That's the first statement the Alter Rebbe makes. And then he continues. He continues explaining. V'tzimtzem HaKadosh Baruch Hu retzeinei v'chachmosei b'taryag mitzvahs ha'teru b'ilchasein. Where's this amvon vosanusei? Where do you see this humility? Where do you see the concentrated energy of the divine in a structural way? So he did this by the Gebish to God, the blessed be He, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, compacted, you can say, or concentrated, in Yiddish, reingequetscht, or eingequetscht, his will and his wisdom, even though on its own it could be totally infinitely expansive. So what did he do? Tzamtzim HaKadosh Baruch Hu ritzenu v'chachmosei, where? B'taryag mitzvahs ha'teru b'ilchaseim. In a structure. And what is that structure? In his will and wisdom, into the 613 commandments of the Torah and their associated laws. Ub'ilchaseim. And it goes even further. That's in their number and their structure. Then he continues. U'b'tzirufe eisius, Torah, Nevi'im, v'ksuvim. And into the texts of the Torah that are also structured. The Torah, Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim. The Torah, the prophets, and the writings. The Droshe Sehen, he continues, as well as their commentaries. And where are these droshes? Sheba Godes u'b'medrashe Chachameinu zichrenim levracha. The commentaries in the Agodes and the Midrashim, the homilies, and the narratives of the sages, zichrenim levracha. So we're talking now Torah Shebal Peh. So all of this, the Eibishter took his greatness and he so-called packaged it and directed and guided it into Taryag mitzvahs and to, he says clearly, Tzirufe Asius, which is to the text of Torah. Tzirufe Asius is more than just text. It means the permutation and the combination of letters. You take letters and you turn them into words. That's structure. That would seem to defy that would seem to be the opposite of Bligvul, Ein Sof. Nobody's taken that Ein Sof and packaged it here, and it's also expression of his Ein Sof. There's expression in that's brought by Chazal, Tzamtzim Atzmei bin Shnei Badei Ha'odin. The Eibishter so-called concentrated himself between the two rods of the ark, of the holy ark. Tzimtzum here doesn't mean diminished or concealed. It means concentrated. It means that he's focused it in this area. So the Bligvul of Elokus essentially is now packaged in the structure of Torah Mitzvahs. And that makes Torah Mitzvahs different than everything else in creation. You don't say that, for example, when the Eibishter created Demim Tzameach Chai Medaber. Let's not talk about Medaber. Demim Tzameach Chai. He created minerals, vegetables, vegetation, plants, animals. There, Bereshis bara Elokim, he took his words and yes, created a finite creature. In it, of course, lies God's infinite power. But what manifests is God's finite, specific creation. He wants it to be that. Torah retains, remember, Torah is an extension of Ivareh de Malka. So basically what the Eibishter did was he took a way of expressing his whole sense of self. That Ein Sof of himself is now in the structure of Torah mitzvahs. So now when we do a mitzvah or we learn Torah, we're not just learning wisdom or doing a good act. Just like we said with the Eibishter before, it's not just the decrees of the king, it's actually a part of him, so to speak. So when we do it, we're experiencing a part of him, and as we said before, so there's a certain unity between God's expression, infinite expression, and his expression in the finite structure. The same place you find his greatness, you find his humility. And then he's going to continue now and explain what's the purpose of this. Why did the Eibishter do this? It wasn't just coming to show a trick, because this will fulfill the very essence of the purpose of creation and the reason there's Torah mitzvahs and how neshamas come to use. And that we will continue in the next year. This program and all the programs can be found at TanyaApply.com, which is part of a larger website, ChassidusApply.com. You can also submit your questions there. A gute Woche, be well, and we'll see you next week.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChassidusApply.com for archived classes and more resources.